Algae filling the reflecting pool here in Washington and peeling paint are leading to vandalism claims from the president and criticism from Democrats. Trump is now threatening vandals with a 10-year prison sentence for defacing the newly renovated landmark. Democratic Senator Jeff Merkley took his critique to social media, saying, quote, after railing about waste, fraud, and abuse, the Trump administration spent $14 million on a reflecting pool reno that's now peeling and chock full of algae. I'm pressing to get answers for this embarrassing waste of resources.
President Trump says the reflecting pool will probably need to be drained again and work will begin immediately. This to fix what some consider just to be a really bad repair job. He says it is vandalism. Several people were arrested over the weekend for allegedly vandalizing the pool, including a 3-time U.S. Olympian. The president claimed that some of them were pouring toxic chemicals into the water. They say they were just touching the paint at the bottom that was peeling off. I want to get right to CNN's Tom Foreman. Tom, I know you spent a lot of time there over the last few days. I'm glad to see you are not in federal custody. You're here to report on what you have seen.
Yeah, talk about money literally down the drain. They're talking about draining this thing now, and I guess kind of starting over to repair what happened. What the White House and other officials are claiming is that people went in there and at some point slashed or sort of pulling up this material from the bottom down there, this hard sort of plastic material that's all this blue. You hear it called paint. It seems to be more of a true liner that was sort of formed there. Nonetheless, it is coming up in some places. We don't know how many really. And they're fighting the continuing algae problem. And if you listen to the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, they are pledging to use the full weight of the law to go after anybody who's messing with any of it. Listen to her.
And there are several citations that have been handed out to individuals, and these are cases that will be prosecuted to the full extent. If there are more serious products that are put into the reflecting pool to create more algae or a bigger problem, then we'll consider more serious charges.
Here's the thing. There's no evidence being offered by the authorities that any of this happened, especially this idea of adding chemicals that cause the algae. In fact, all the experts we have talked to have suggested from the beginning that the liner itself was perhaps not a great idea. Dark blue would spur more algae growth by capturing more heat. That was one of their ideas. And that algae this time of year has always been very common here, and that nothing that they did to renovate this pool would have addressed that issue. That's why it continues to be very bright green. We do know from one person who was arrested, a former Olympian, David Hearn, a man who competed for this country. He says he was arrested because he was touching the surface there. He competed in the slalom canoe for the United States. He said he was touching the bottom of it because he's trained in material sciences. He was just curious what the stuff was, but that he made no difference to it. He didn't damage it. He didn't break it. There was nothing about the reflecting pool that was in any different condition after I left there than it had before I went there yesterday. I didn't remove anything. I didn't break, tear, peel, or rip, or destroy anything, and yet he says he was taken into custody for several hours. We have been trying to get authorities to give us any more information on who the other people are and what exactly they supposedly did that now has the President of the United States saying they ruined his great big project. Nothing yet. All we know is that this is $14 million, 7 times more than the original prediction made by the president for the cost of this, and there are no real signs that the pool is any better off for all of it. John?
Yeah, $14 million already. That's not counting what it will cost to drain it again, maybe paint the bottom again, and do the whole thing over again.
Yeah, and they wanted it by July 4th, which is closing in really fast. So it's hard to imagine that all of that could be done fast. And by the way, the sped up schedule to get it done fast has a lot of experts saying, well, that was the key problem. This needed to be done slowly, methodically, over time, and you tried to rush it, and that created a problem.
And still no comment from the algae. Tom Foreman, thank you for your reporting on all of this. Appreciate it. With us now, CNN senior legal analyst Elie Honig. If these people, as they say, were touching floating paint pieces in the pool, is that really a crime?
Well, if that's indeed all that happened, John, then no, there is no federal crime for merely touching federal property. There is, of course, a federal law that prohibits people from destroying or damaging federal property. And by the way, if you want some instances where that's been easy to apply. Look, for example, at January 6th. Dozens of those rioters were charged with destroying property at the Capitol. Or, more recently, look at examples of anti-ICE protesters who were charged and convicted for destroying government property if they destroyed government vehicles or damaged government buildings. In this case, it's all going to come down to this in all of these cases. If these people were leaning into the reflecting pool and ripping up or tearing up that lining, then yes, this law could apply at its lower levels. But if all they were doing was leaning in out of curiosity and touching the lining or touching floating paint, then no, there is no crime to that.
So the line may be between touching and pulling. Let's say they were pulling here, Ellie. What kind of a crime are we talking about here specifically?
So it's the dividing line here is $1,000. If a person causes more than $1,000 of damage to federal property, then it's going to be a felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. All of these cases, however, including the ones who've been charged, are going to be misdemeanors because it's under $1,000. Now, that's really important because misdemeanors are procedurally different from felonies. First of all, the max penalty on a misdemeanor is just 1 year in prison. Almost nobody ever goes to prison on a first-time misdemeanor. Also, in a misdemeanor, prosecutors don't actually have to go to a grand jury to indict. They can do it unilaterally under a document called a criminal information. And last and most importantly, depending on what level of misdemeanor it is, a person may or may not be entitled to a jury trial. So if a person's charged with what we call a Class A misdemeanor, which these would be, you can get a jury trial. But if you're charged with the lower level misdemeanors, Class B and C, then you're not entitled to a jury trial. You just have to go to a judge. But the cyclist, for example, is charged with the Class A misdemeanor. So he's going to have an option of having his case adjudicated either by a judge or a jury. That's going to be up to him.
What would you maybe advise him here? Or what would he be thinking in terms of whether a jury trial would be good for him?
You know, a lot of misdemeanor defendants waive the jury trial and say, I'll just go with a judge. But in this case, if I was advising this guy, I would tell him 100% you are taking your jury trial because this is Washington, D.C. Donald Trump, we know, is very unpopular in D.C. In all three elections that he ran for president, he got under 10% of the vote in D.C. Start with that. We've also seen evidence that D.C. grand juries and trial juries have been rejecting some of these cases that they see as political. We've seen D.C. grand juries refuse to indict protesters, anti-ICE protesters. We've seen D.C. grand juries reject the potential case against Senator Mark Kelly and other Democrats. We've seen a D.C. trial jury reject the case, you'll remember this, of the individual who threw the Subway sandwich at an ICE agent, even though he did it on tape. So if I'm advising this defendant, I'd say take note of that. These D.C. juries and grand juries, they've had enough with what they see as political prosecutions, and I think that would be his best chance.
Ellie Honig, thank you so much for the legal side of what is a political and, frankly, a reconstruction story more than anything else. Thank you very much.